I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
I'm speaking with James Corbett. He's the publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's speaking with us from Japan. Welcome back to the show, James.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure.
Has there been much of a discussion about the vote that's about to happen in Britain, whether they should stay in the European Union?
Well, it is what all eyes are turned to economically this week, and I think the markets here in Asia as well as around the world are very much looking forward to this decision because it is the uncertainty which is holding a lot of players back from the markets, according to a lot of the financial speculators and insiders. So I think everyone's very concerned about it from an economic perspective because, of course, it does have ramifications, or at least could have ramifications for the UK's trading relationship with the rest of the world and also the consolidation, whether the European Union will be able to hold together if Britain does leave. And that will obviously have impacts on Europe's trading relationship with the world. So obviously some pretty huge stakes, and the uncertainty, as I say, is what's killing a lot of investors right now. So there hasn't been a whole lot of movement this week, as markets, I think, are basically bracing themselves for a vote. However, having said that, I hope we're not too pre-recorded here because maybe the vote's already happened by the time people are listening to this. But I would be very shocked if Britain does vote for Brexit. I know that the momentum has kind of gone out of the sails of the Brexit side of the equation in the last few days, and I find it very unlikely that they're actually going to do that. And even if they did, as even the BBC and other outlets are reporting, it is not a legally binding referendum, and the pro-Remain camp has a very solid lead in terms of the numbers in the House of Parliament. So again, they could put parliamentary brakes on any sort of exit process.
Right, so if it's very close, they could say, well, folks, it's statistically too close to call, so we're just going to leave things as they are.
They certainly could do that, and again, it's not legally binding in any way, so there's really no roadmap for how that would go about, even if they did proceed with it. So I think that once this shakes out, even if it is a pro-Brexit vote, but although, I'm not expecting that, I don't think it's going to have a huge effect on the markets, which obviously are pricing in a status quo.
It looks like the arguments have really come down to two sides. Those who want to leave say, we don't want uncontrolled migration into Britain. And those who want to stay say, look at the economic benefits we have being part of the world's biggest trading bloc.
Yes, and it's unfortunate that the conversation is really centered so closely on those sides of the issue because, of course, I think the more fundamental issue, and one that Ambrose Evans-Pritchard touched on a recent article, editorial in The Telegraph, where he put himself in the Leave camp, was that what this ultimately comes down to is the ability for a nation to determine its political sovereignty. It is about whether or not the UK should be ruled from Brussels through politicians who have very little, if any, democratic accountability to the British people. And I think that really should be, or should have been, the core part of this campaign, because there's really no argument that can be made on the pro-EU side from that perspective. The only argument that can be made is, somehow being in the walled garden of the European Union will be better for our economy. But it's disingenuous to say that that's the core issue. I think the core issue is about political sovereignty, and that, to some extent, that got lost in the mix, especially in recent days with the murder of Joe Cox.
Yes, and emotions will always overrule rational thought, won't they?
Unfortunately so, and the electorate has never, of any country, has never been accused of using a solely rational basis for their decision-making.
Once this vote clears, people said, of course, we can always live and adjust, even if they vote to leave, and they did leave. so many agreements are in place that trade would probably continue just as it does today. And if it wasn't, they'd make the adjustments right away, maybe even passing emergency bills in the House of Commons. Are people so locked in the past that when they've seen breakups before, they think it's disastrous? Czechoslovakia broke up, and it seems to me no one is worse the wear out of there, and nobody fought. In Ukraine, however, they have a deadly civil war underway. Syria, Libya, other countries where they didn't have a democratic means to decide which way to go, and you see that millions of people die, and 65 million people now were displaced from their homes last year, a record according to the United Nations.
That's right. I think it's the uncertainty of events like these that are the most destabilizing, because as you say, there's nothing that the UK can't do that the European Union can do in terms of negotiating trade deals with various partners. It would have a destabilizing effect because it would mean changes, and it would mean that there might have to be some sort of emergency stopgap agreements put in place as they figure out how to proceed. But I think the real question is what this would mean for the European Union as a whole. Would it be able to survive with a major player like Britain removing itself from that union, and especially with sentiment against the European Union even higher in some of the core EU states, especially France right now? There's a lot of anti-EU sentiment that would certainly embolden that portion of the French electorate, and in other places like Germany, where again people are not happy with the European Union in general. And I don't think that no matter again whether Britain votes Remain or exit, I don't think that trend is going to change fundamentally. I think people are increasingly disenchanted with the European Union and the fact that it is not living up to its promise that it was offering the people, that this would somehow be the only way that they could compete on an international stage. I think we've seen with the crashing and burning of the Eurozone in recent years that a lot of that was oversold, and too many things were included in the mix too quickly in a way that has not resulted in unmitigated good for the European Union as a whole.
Right. And I think their biggest problem is the lack of immigration controls. Once you're in the European Union, it's open borders for both people and trade. And I think Britain's biggest fear is that if Turkey does join the European Union, that's another 90 million Muslims who would have the right to just walk in.
Right, and really this plays into both camps, because the pro-EU camp will say, well, what we need is a more firmly consolidated border guard or border control that is European run. And so the real issue, I mean, again, comes back to whether there is national sovereignty and people can determine their national interests, or whether this is going to be done at an international level.
And so many countries now that have accepted hundreds of thousands of refugees and all the problems those bring up. Economic studies show that refugees and migrants are actually good for your economy in the long run.
It depends. Yes, and I think there is that phenomenon, but it depends on how many refugees at what time, in what situation, and in what way they are integrated into the society. And in a situation where there is a huge influx all of a sudden, it's quite different than if there is, a steady stream of refugees over a long period of time. So, the cultural dislocation, I think, is what a lot of people are really concerned about in this case. It is changing the way that people view themselves and view their neighbors, so it is going to have that effect. And unfortunately, again, as this happens during a time where there is a lot of very profound economic instability and financial instability, of course, that will be seized upon in a correlation, even if no causation way, by political demagogues who want to make a scapegoat population. It will be very easy to pin the blame on refugees. So it's a destabilizing influence politically, and I think that has economic ramifications.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after the break.
I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese, Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. James, are they paying more attention now to the presidential battle between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump Today, Donald Trump calling Hillary a professional liar. Of course, she's had some choice words for Donald as well, saying he bankrupted his way to success. Is that his plan for America?
It's difficult to tell because there's very little in terms of policy statements that he has issued that have not been directly contradicted by previous statements that he's made. So it's difficult to tell where he stands on any issue, which I think is probably actually the point of the campaign. But if we are to take at face value statements about his preference for going back down to 0% interest rates with basically free Fed money printing as the way to move America forward, I think people have to be concerned about that, and his idea that they're going to renegotiate the terms of American bond issues. Again, some pretty out there kind of ideas, but who knows if he plans on doing that? So I think the campaign really is about throwing everything at the wall because something will stick, and then you can always say, well, look, we said this, even if you said the exact opposite before that. And then, of course, the Hillary has the problem of even a lot of her supporters, I think, don't actually really like Hillary per se. They just don't like Donald. So it's becoming one of those campaigns. It's almost a which candidate do you hate less campaign, which is certainly not what the U.S. needs right now. It needs someone with some sort of vision about what can actually happen, and that's obviously not the political conversation that's going to take place this time.
In China, I saw a news story the other night where people in this one town were protesting because their local communist leader had been jailed on what they said were trumped up and false corruption charges. They said the reason he was jailed is he was standing up for homeowner rights because their properties were being expropriated by large corporations. Any fallout from that?
I haven't seen that story in particular, so I can't comment on it. But that is an interesting phenomenon because certainly I think that the cleanup of Chinese politics, quote unquote, that Xi Jinping had promised when first coming into office, and which he is to some extent following up on, has to be seen, at least in part, as a political tool that is wielded against people who are going against party interests, or more specifically against Xi Jinping and his clique. It is a bit of a political tool that they will come in and swoop down on corrupt officials when and if and as it suits them. And I think we have to see it as that. As all laws really are in all polities, they are selectively enforced and political in nature. And I think there's no difference when it comes down to the crackdown of corruption in China.
A Globe and Mail report claims the Chinese are executing massive numbers of political prisoners to give them organs to be transplanted for figures in the six figures, over $100,000 per transplant. This article claims anywhere from 60 to 100,000 people a year are being killed so their organs can be harvested. Official numbers from China say about 6,800 people a year are getting organ transplants. Is there any truth to this?
It's difficult to say because obviously we're not going to get those types of numbers from official sources. So the best we can do is put kind of estimates on them. And unfortunately, again, the estimates will often come through organizations which have vested interests in trying to smear the Chinese government. So I have no doubt there is truth to it, but how much truth, I suppose, is the operative question. And again, it's very difficult to say from an outside position, with both sides of the issue obviously heavily biased one way or another.
Mitsubishi Motors is reporting their first loss in 8 years, over $1 billion in connection to the mileage scandal. How big of a blow is that to the Japanese economy?
It's fairly big. It's pretty substantial, not only directly because of Mitsubishi Motors Corp., which obviously is a huge player in the Japanese economy, but also because Mitsubishi is part of a larger conglomerate or association of companies, which is one of the sort of part of the corporatocracy, as it were, in Japan. There are really only a handful of major players in Japanese industry, and they generally have these large umbrellas of various offshoots, and Mitsubishi is one of them. So, for example, The largest commercial bank here is Mitsubishi UFJ. It's part of that same group of companies. So any major loss like this is not just destabilizing to the car manufacturing industry here and the exports, but also to industry on a wider scale. So it really does have to be taken quite seriously, and I think it is being taken seriously here.
And of course, there was the airbag maker, Tanaka.
I believe Tanaka, yes.
Yeah, Tanaka, where they supplied most of the airbags to most of the Japanese makes and models. So many cars being recalled because of that. People have died because of it. Are they going to invest? And then we also had the Toyota scandal where the cars were staying in drive and the accelerators would lock floor down. Have there been any more calls in Japan that perhaps they should go back to their old industrial culture where you made sure that you made the very best possible device, not the cheapest?
Well, I think that I'm sure there are calls along those lines. And sorry, I was wrong. It was Takata airbag.
Right.
I think there probably are calls along those lines, but I think that might be a bit dreaming of a past that never was, per se. Really, the corporate culture here is to get away with what you can and cut corners that you can, and then when it comes out and the scandal breaks and people die or whatever it may be, have the director of the company resign in a big florid way and make big, deep bows of apology to the public, and then just replace him with someone new and continue business practices as usual. That certainly has been the corporate culture here, at least for a couple of decades. So I think it might be a bit pie in the sky to think that there's some sort of return to Japanese industry that can really happen here. Unfortunately, this is the sort of status quo of Japanese corporate culture at this moment, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
In Europe, the European Union now is proposing a law that would classify robots as electronic persons, and people who employ these electronic persons will have to pay social security taxes. What about the reaction in Japan? Who invented the robot?
It's a strange world that we're moving into right now, and I think people are starting to catch on, but I still think few people really appreciate how quickly this is going to start transforming the economy, because we have become accustomed to the idea of manual laborers on assembly lines being replaced by automation. But we are already reaching the point where now white-collar office jobs are starting to be mechanized in various ways, because so many middle managers really are number pushers and number crunchers that do not necessarily require a human element. And anything that does not necessarily require a human element is going to be automated. Now, I don't know about this latest proposal in the EU and the idea of robot social security. I've never heard of this, but I think we are going to start seeing some very strange things as we, as a society, as a civilization, as a species, try to grapple with what these changes will mean in terms of the transformation of the economy. And there's so much potential for so much good that can come from this type of transformation, but there will be a lot of people who will be left on the wayside, by the wayside as well. And I think a lot of countries are going to have to start looking very soon at the ways that they will or will not be able to take care of those people in that transition. And what will it look like on the other side? I think the science fiction writers probably have a better grasp of this than most of the public.
Well, the science fiction writers never predicted the cell phone, and look how that's changed society. And I don't think they've ever thought about what happens when, like in the first Total Recall movie, there was Johnny Cab, the robot driving the car. What's that going to do? I mean, Tokyo expects to have robot cab drivers when they host the Olympics in 2020.
Yes. I mean, again, I don't think the changeover can be stressed enough, that just how completely and fundamentally this will happen. And it's different than a lot of changeovers that have happened in the past, where you went from horses and buggies to cars. Well, okay, so people went from being, horseshoe makers to car makers. In this changeover, there doesn't seem like there's going to be the types of jobs to replace. I mean, they don't need as many people to create the robots as they do the jobs that will actually be taken by the robots. So I think we're going through a fundamental transition, and even 20 years from now, I imagine that the economy is going to look fundamentally different. Now, this I suppose could line up well with the demographic crunch that is coming, because obviously as baby boomers retire and start to die, there are not enough workers to replace them. So this might come at a opportune time, but again, so much of this is in how the changeover takes place and in how the people who slip through the cracks are going to be handled. And if they are not handled properly, and if a lot of people end up homeless and jobless and without any prospect of employment, that is the ingredients for revolution. So I think we're moving into some very destabilizing times, and there's a huge question mark over how this will play out, not just economically, but politically.
Yeah, and maybe the Terminator movies will come true, humans versus robots.
Maybe the robots will get a vote. Who knows?
Well, if they're paying tax, no taxation without representation. James, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you for taking the time.
My guest has been James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He was speaking to us from Japan. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Questions for the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.